Sony released this new lens.
A G Master?
Yep.
So it's basically perfect?
Yes, it is. End of review. Thanks for watching. Just joking, this one's actually quite special this time round. We're looking at a 14mm f1.8 G Master. Now, calling this an impossible lens while holding it in my hands is a bit of an oxymoron, but this particular plastic barrel filled with glass is actually hugely baffling from an engineering perspective. Before this came about, there was only one other lens to ever flaunt a combination of focal length this wide and an aperture this large, and it was this big. The Sigma 14mm 1.8 was a humongous lens. It was almost 3 times as heavy, but it was also expectedly so. It's not like there was any alternative either, there was just nothing else in its class. Until Sony came along. And the first time I was handed the Sony 14mm lens, I had to do a double take because I couldn't believe it was a possible size for a 14mm f1.8. But lo and behold, those guys did it. Everything we knew true about ultra-wide lenses being a challenge to design, being big and heavy, being optically compromised at large apertures, this lens just took all those expectations and bolted down the opposite way. This thing is in the same size range as the 24mm G Master, and it only weighs around 460 grams. For reference, the EF version of the Sigma 14 1.8 is over 1.1 kilos without any adapters, and despite being so much smaller, the G Master's image quality still somehow beats the Sigma, which already had a reputation for excellent image quality. The Sigma was already pushing the limits of ultra-wide primes in a market where everything else capped out at f2.8. You could argue that the Sigma was designed for DSLR systems and the G Master had the advantage of being designed for E-mount mirrorless, but I would still absolutely consider the G Master to be boundary breaking because this difference is just way too big. And it's not just about form factor. I mentioned how the Sigma 14 sets a pretty high bar for image quality, and the G Master does indeed top that. A lens like this should be an instant favorite for astrophotography, so coma is going to be a particular area of interest. And the G Master formidably exhibits practically no coma wide open at f1.8. Comparing the G Master against the Sigma, coma is very noticeable on the latter. The 14 G Master also suppresses flare noticeably better than the Sigma. However, in terms of sharpness, these two lenses are much closer. Excellent in the center even when wide open. The G Master does do a little better in the corners compared to the Sigma. There's better contrast and less aberration. I should note for the G Master how impressive the corner resolution is for an ultra-wide. Of course, it won't be as good as the center, even if you stop it down, although I don't think it's likely you'll be framing any subjects there either. Now, ultimately, people who see your photos aren't really going to care which one of these 14mm primes you shot it with. However, the form factor of this G Master, I think, is going to completely change how often a 14 1.8 gets packed into a camera bag. And it's not just because this has got better image quality, it's because I don't have to carry a cannonball around. The Sigma 14 was a lens you would only pack if a certain task required it. But the 14 G Master, you would treat it like you would any small lens. It slimmed itself out of the special purpose category. Or should I say you'll see this actually being used for something other than astrophotography?
We are out in the middle of nowhere, which is arguably the safest place in the world to test out a certain wide-angle, unreleased, large aperture lens from Sony.
And unlike the Sigma, the G Master does not feel front-heavy in the slightest. This becomes a lens you could comfortably accommodate on a gimbal. Again, quite surreal to say that there is a full-frame 14mm f1.8 lens that's gimbal-friendly. And while extremely overkill, this would, yes, in theory, be an amazing vlogging lens if you're into creating G Master quality vlogs.
This 14 1.8 has a hood built permanently into the lens. It's actually very common for ultra-wide lenses to have this, but for a lens sporting this design, the front element is actually not as bulbous as one would think. Still, I don't think it would have been feasible to give it front filter threads given its incredibly wide field of view. Instead, there is a slot at the back of the lens for gel filters. It's a bit oddly shaped, but the lens does come with a cutting template. Now here's another thing that's kind of weird to talk about on an ultra-wide. Bokeh. The f1.8 bokeh we're associated with is not going to hit right away on this due to the short focal length, so it won't be the most apparent thing when looking at an image from this lens, although you could soften your background visibly if you get close to your subject. And this G Master did hit me with one final surprise. it doesn't cost as much as I thought it would. I have the confirmed Malaysian pricing for this. It's 6,799 ringgit, which is the same price that they are selling here the 35G Master for. So it's very likely that this would cost somewhere between $1,300 to $1,500. I was wholly expecting a lens like this to break the $2,000 mark, but apparently Sony doesn't charge a premium for making a lens impossibly small. Again, this and the Sigma 14 are currently the only lenses that have an aperture as bright as f1.8 at a focal length this wide. But if you are in the E-mount ecosystem, it's likely not a very difficult choice between the 14G Master and the $1,600 Sigma 14 1.8. So that's it from me. If you'd like to hear another's opinion on this lens, check out Jayz's review of this same lens over at Lens Library's YouTube channel. And seriously, this is the 6th lens that Sony has released this year. At the current rate, that's an average of 1.5 lenses per month.